I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you are settled into your couch or your favorite chair, getting ready to watch a movie. You've got a bowl of popcorn, and you don't know what the plot of the movie is. And as it opens, it all of a sudden is more tense than you thought it was going to be. The music is doom and gloom. There's a timer counting down, and someone looking over their shoulder with some expectation that seems intense. And then all of a sudden it stops. And the screen says 48 hours earlier. Sometimes we tell a story this way. We get a glimpse of what is going to come at the end, and then we back up to the beginning and tell that story. And in a movie like that, we eventually catch up to that timer that's counting down and that doom and gloom music and the intensity of it, and then finish the story from there. In our narratives of faith, we have glimpses of the end. The prophets talk about the great day of judgment of the Lord. We have this expectation that Jesus is going to return and reconcile all that is with God. We can look at the book of Revelation, where it says there will be a new heaven and a new earth. All of these are glimpses of the end. Now, when we back up then to the beginning, we can tell that story as a faith narrative from Genesis. But today we hear from Paul in 1 Corinthians. And in Paul's words in that 7th chapter, it seems like he is at the end or thinks the end is near. We've already had the glimpse of the end from our faith narrative. And here Paul is saying the time is short. And because the time is short, he does a pretty good laundry list of things that we as people engage with, right? He says if you're married, act as if you're not. If you're grieving or if you're rejoicing, don't do those things either. If you have possessions, don't worry about that. Your dealings with the world. And in this, we might think then of family, of economics, of the social connections and the ways we are engaged with one another. And Paul seems to be saying none of that matters, because the present form of the world is passing away. It's as if we have heard the beginning, we've gotten a glimpse of the end, and Paul thinks we're very, very close to it. This idea of the end coming and the end times has taken up a lot of our theological imagination as people of faith. And often, most of the time, actually, I find that ends up being in places that I find to be harmful. I have sat with more than one person as they are nearing death who have said to me, Pastor, I don't know if I'm going to make the cut. Am I in or am I out? And they'll say, I don't know if I've been good enough or kind enough in my life. And some of these people have spent their entire lives, decades, hearing that God's grace is a free gift and that there's nothing we can do to earn it. But as that end is nearing, they are so driven by this larger imagination we have that you're either going to make it or you're not, that they start to struggle. Other times, we have death around us, and when someone dies, we say they've gone to a better place, which implies that this world we live in is a terrible place to be, and we need to escape it to this better place. Now, that glimpse we get from Revelation talks about this new heaven and a new earth, and it's actually coming down to us, God joining us where we are. And so that idea of escaping this place maybe isn't quite what that glimpse is all about. And yet, we live with this sense that maybe we should just bide our time here until we can get there. The other way I find it harmful is that sometimes we think that if we can just get enough other people to believe the way we believe and come to know Jesus the way we do, then they'll make the cut at the end. And that's good, right? And that's partly to our credit for the work that we do. And that sort of thinking has caused all kinds of abuse in people who have tried to strong-arm others into believing in Jesus the way that they do. And in all of these things, I find that there is a decided sort of self-focus, right? If I'm nearing the end and I'm worried about my final destiny, that's about me. If others have not understood Jesus the way I have, and I've worried about their destiny and feel like I have to do something about that, that's also then about me. So that if we hear this passage from Paul and hear its urgency as one about the end is almost here, that might drive us to some interesting places. But we now are a couple of thousand years on, And that end doesn't seem like it's any closer than it apparently was for Paul. So maybe Paul's not actually talking about the end being near. What if instead Paul is talking about not the beginning, but a new beginning? Right? We know the beginning and we get all the way up to Jesus dying and rising. Maybe what Paul is talking about is that this time being short, is that the time is short for us to really engage in this gift of life we get in Jesus' resurrection. So that we're not at the end of the story, but somewhere in the middle where this new creation and this new beginning then invites us into living that gift of life. But there's still that little bit where Paul says the present world is passing away. And I think maybe what Paul is really inviting us to do is not to anticipate that we're at the end of the story, but to understand that the world is constantly, always changing around us. The present world is always passing away. And that Jesus is doing something new in the space that follows. None of us like change. I spent almost a decade as an IT consultant where my job was to show up in people's offices where change was happening. In some of those places, they asked for the change. They knew the change was going to be good. They were in some ways excited about the change, but at the same time they feared it and were uncertain about it because they didn't know what it was going to mean. We often resist change. We don't like it. We don't want it. Just leave things the way they are. And we pretend as if change doesn't happen. I'm mindful of some phone Bible study a couple of us here had with my friend Pastor Rob in Michigan and some people from his church a few years ago. In the middle of that conversation, a member of his congregation that had been there for 50 years, 50, said, "I've been here 50 years and this place hasn't changed at all." To which Pastor Rob said, "I've been here for 12 years and it's changed a lot." When you're in a place like a church for a long period of time, it can seem like things aren't changing. A new person or family shows up, and sooner or later it just feels like they've always been here. People move away or people die, and we grieve and miss them. And yet there's this core that continues. I left my home church to go off to seminary, and the first time I went back a year later, it seemed like a whole different group of people. But if you had been there that whole time, it wouldn't have. Because that change is slow and it unfolds over time. And so we get to this place where we don't believe the world is always changing and we resist that change. And yet the change is drastic. I think of my dad's mom. She was born as the Russian Revolution was unfolding. She lived 94 years through multiple wars, through the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. She grew up on a farm with horses, not cars. Hadn't seen a plane yet at that point, and probably had an outhouse and no electricity. And by the time she died, the iPhone had been invented. We had been to the moon. That is a drastic amount of change in just one lifetime. But really it unfolds bit by bit so that the present world is always passing away. Even in my 47, almost 47 years, there has been tremendous change just in my lifetime. So what I think Paul is telling us is not that our families and our economics and our social connections are unimportant, but that all of those things are changing, and that being caught up in this grace and this new gift of life in Jesus is what grounds us to live well in that change and navigate that newness that is always coming at us, to have some grace and some patience to live into that change, not just to be afraid of it or uncertain about it. Now, just as I anticipate that Paul is inviting us to think about change, I think of our culture as one that has always had this tension between progress and tradition. Always wanting to go faster, higher, build stronger, have more, and at the same time cling to what was. And those things are often at odds, right? Something has to be let go of so that new thing can happen. Now, I don't think that Paul is inviting us to live in the tension between progress and tradition. But I do think Paul is inviting us to live in the tension of the way things have been and the new things that Jesus invites us to live into. Now, Paul certainly would include in that, I think, all of the sorts of technology and other changes that happen around us all the time. But I think he has something particular in mind. As he talks about the present world passing away, I suspect for him it's a lot more about relationships and human connections, because Paul knew people. In another place, Paul says that there will no longer be Jew or Greek, or we might say Gentile. There will no longer be slave or free. There will no longer be male or female. In that little just list of 3 pairs, Paul is trying to say that Jesus has erased the lines that we have that divide one another, and all of us get gathered up into the oneness of Jesus. Now, that little short list of 3 things actually covers a lot of territory. The difference between Jew and Gentile, or Jew and Greek, would highlight both religious understandings of who God is and how God's work, and also ethnic differences from different people in different places. The difference between slave and free would capture up some of those same things, but also power dynamics. Who has power? Who gets to decide things? Who doesn't? Who gets marginalized? Who is left out? Then we get to the third one, and you've got the difference between male and female, which in Paul's world would have been drastically different experiences of society and economics and all the rest. So that what Paul is lifting up for us is religion, ethnicity, right? Or we might today say nationality, power, and gender, and all of the kind of lines that get drawn there. And when he says the present world is passing away, perhaps Paul is saying that these ways we've understood that we are different and disconnected, all of that is erased by Jesus, and this new creation is coming where we are all gathered up into the oneness of God. Paul knew people, as I said. He also knew that you have to meet them where they are. There's another place where Paul talks about reaching out to those Gentile people and saying, I am all things to all people, right? He tries to meet people where they are, let them be who they are, so that then they can be connected into this oneness which he proclaims. Now, Paul proclaimed this nearly 2,000 years ago, but his list is still very present today. We have not totally figured out at all how to live as multiple religions in the same community or multiple ethnicities. We still have plenty of struggle with that. We still have struggles with slavery, whether it's human trafficking or in other ways that humans are put into bondage. We still struggle with gender inequality, and even in our day, deeper understandings of what gender even is. And so the invitation from Paul, right, to understand that the world is changing, constantly dying to what it is, and Jesus doing something new, is also an invitation to do what he did, which is to meet people where they are and to keep working into this newness that we have been gifted with. It may not always be easy to see for some of us, but anti-Semitism is alive and well in our nation and in our world, as is Islamophobia. And sometimes we participate in it in ways that we don't even understand we are doing. This week has been a great example. If you've been paying any attention to the internet, you have probably seen memes of Bernie in his mittens and his coat pasted into all kinds of different pictures, some of which are good fun. But those pictures have also been pasted into church pictures or made into stained glass windows in churches and different kinds of images that are connected to Christianity. But he's Jewish. And so for some of us, we may skip right past that and think it's just another meme that's funny. But there are other people who are Jewish who have experienced great harm at the hands of Christianity. People who see a Nazi flag and shudder because of what it has meant for their family over time because of the Holocaust and the Nazis, to where these things are not funny to them but hurtful, right? And so those are just little examples of a broader thing that's still there where we still have work to do. Perhaps we have made some progress, but we are not done yet, right? The world is still passing away and Jesus is still bringing new things to us. Just as there's human trafficking around us of all sorts, we also do continue in this country to live with the legacy of slavery that we were founded on. And with that legacy of slavery, we continue to have racism or white supremacy among us. And those things are all part of this world that is passing away, and Jesus is inviting us to do new things in new places. And that is part of our journey of faith. We certainly still have inequality of pay and other experiences between male and female, but we also, in our present day, have a much deeper understanding of human sexuality and gender identity. And for some of us, that may be hard to understand, that someone doesn't identify as one or the other, or that someone's gender feels completely foreign to them. And yet, if we are to listen to Paul, right, that the world we have known is passing away and Jesus is inviting us into something new, perhaps our task is to meet people where they are and understand who they are and how they are, and to follow Jesus into those new places. All of this means that we're not at the end of the story, but at the beginning. A few years ago, we became a reconciling in Christ congregation here at Salem, which means we are open and affirming of all people of all kinds, including the LGBTQ community. That was not the end of a journey, just like Paul's words here are not the end, but a new beginning. And that new beginning means that we still have work to do to continue to meet people where they are and to help our culture live into this newness so that all people along the way can know God's love. As we settle in then to this story, we can think of it as some end-timesy kind of thing, but I really think Paul is really inviting us to live fully into the new life that Jesus gives us, and that time being short is a timer that ticks down every day, and every day invites us into new places of being. The music for this text is not indeed that doom and gloom, but it is a soundtrack of hope that Jesus' newness is going to crack into this world and open us to new places to know God's love all along the way. Amen.